I was the kind of employee who brewed her own tea at her desk and brought home leftover pastries from the Willow Diner. Quiet, forgettable. Or so they thought. Trent always smiled too much when he walked through the office, like the kind of man who'd been told his whole life that his smile could fix any problem. I noticed him long before he noticed me, not because he was charming, but because he had a habit of glancing over people's shoulders like they were glass doors to open. That Thursday was a blur of keyboard clicks and refilled mugs. I'd skipped lunch, opting instead to finish the final tweaks on my AI module, a health assistance tool designed for underfunded clinics. I worked on it in the quiet moments no one cared to claim, before morning meetings, after 5 o'clock, the moments the office softened and stopped buzzing. It felt sacred in a way I never talked about. Rosie swung by around 4 with a lopsided smile. Still here? I nodded. Almost done. She peered at the screen, then glanced at the stack of annotated printouts beside me. You're a machine, Harper. Just stubborn, I said, smiling. An hour later, just as I was packing up, Trent strolled in holding 2 lattes, neither of which made it to my desk. He leaned on the edge of my cubicle like he belonged there. Heard you've been working on something interesting. I blinked. Just a concept, not finalized. He tilted his head, curious. Mind showing me? Maybe it was the exhaustion or the faint scent of nutmeg from his coffee, but I opened the file and walked him through it. How the system would prioritize patient queries, the real-time data integration, even the logic tree I'd refined the night before. He nodded along, too much, like a man writing an invisible checklist. Impressive, he said, eyes still on the screen. You always had a knack for unexpected depth. I forced a polite laugh. Thanks, I think. That night, I walked 2 blocks west to Mrs. Bellamy's. Her house was a quilt of warm lights and ivy, and the scent of her garden wrapped around me like an old memory. She was already on the porch, a cardigan draped around her shoulders, a copy of the Oregon Daily Chronicle folded neatly in her lap. The roses are getting stubborn, she said, not looking up. Like me. I knelt beside the garden bed, snipping gently where she pointed. You're not stubborn. You just see things others don't. She laughed. That's one way of putting it. A pause, then, quiet ones like you usually surprise people. You wait and wait. And then, bam, the world sees what it missed. We sat in the dusk a while, drinking chamomile from her mismatched cups. The street lamps flickered on, one by one, casting halos on the sidewalk. Back at my apartment above the bookstore, I reheated a scone and curled up by the window. The silence was comforting until the ping. One new email, subject, exciting company innovation, announced. My breath caught. It was from Trent, a company-wide announcement. I clicked, there it was, the entire concept, my concept, wrapped in corporate jargon, polished slides, and a smiling photo of Trent holding a tablet. No credit line, no mention of development, just him and the idea. My tea turned cold in my hand. It wasn't just the theft. It was realizing I'd never been seen, not truly, until now. When Trent unveiled my prototype like a magician revealing a rabbit, I finally understood. Silence isn't always noble, sometimes it's just permission. I didn't sleep much the night after the announcement. The email was still open on my laptop screen when the sun climbed over the buildings across the street, scattering gold into my apartment like it didn't care whose ideas were stolen. I didn't even have the energy to be angry, only hollow, like something I'd nurtured had been snatched mid-bloom. At the office, everyone buzzed about Trent's visionary pitch. Rosie caught up with me near the break room, her brow pinched. You okay? I gave a half smile. Sure, it's a big day. We joined the others in the glass-walled conference room. Trent stood by the projector, sleeves rolled just right, face lit with the confidence of a man rehearsed in being admired. As you all know, we're heading into a new phase, he began. I've been developing an idea, something to change the game for underserved communities. My stomach turned. I kept my eyes on my notepad. He clicked to the first slide, my interface, lightly reskinned. The layout, the logic structure, even the placeholder icons I'd sketched at 2 in the morning, they were all there. A few heads turned to me. Rosie's mouth tightened. Slide after slide, Trent performed. He fielded questions, used words I'd used, told stories I'd once told over coffee and code, and the room clapped. Later at my desk, Rosie hovered nearby. "That was your deck, wasn't it?" she said quietly. I nodded. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I'd sound petty. There's no email trail, no signature, no proof." She sat on the edge of the desk. "But there might be, right? If you've got older versions saved." I blinked at her, the spark of something, not hope exactly, but direction, rising. That night I opened every folder on my hard drive, every draft, every timestamp. I had more than I thought: screenshots, commits, notes scribbled in margins. Still, I knew it wasn't enough. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. Then I packed my laptop and walked across the street to Mrs. Bellamy's. Her porch light was on, glowing soft. She was watering the flower boxes, even though dusk had fallen. She glanced up as I approached. "You look like someone who needs peppermint tea," she said, opening the screen door before I even knocked. Inside, the kettle hissed gently. Her living room smelled like lemon oil and chamomile. Books lined every wall, except for a small patch where family photos stood. Her in the 70s, flanked by colleagues in bell-bottoms and big hair. "I think I need a lawyer," I said. She didn't flinch. "What kind?" "Someone who understands startups, copyright, ethics." She poured tea, then pulled open a drawer and handed me a business card. "Caleb Norris," I read aloud. "This is your lawyer?" "My former mentee. He went into law when advertising broke his heart. Good man. Lives 2 blocks from here." I traced the raised ink on the card. "Do you think he'd help me?" She gave a small smile. "He helps people who build things. That's you." Back home, I typed an email to Caleb. I attached the files. I kept it short. My finger hovered over the mouse. Then I clicked send. That night, the rain returned to Portland, tapping soft against the glass, steady as a heartbeat. "That was your slide," Rosie had whispered. She was right. That was mine. That was me. You don't plan a war in anger. You plan it with calm fingers, archived files, and a neighbor who's smarter than your entire C-suite combined. The next morning, Caleb replied. His email was short, efficient, and unexpectedly kind. He invited me to his office that afternoon, with a tone that made me feel less like a client and more like a fellow human caught in something unfair. His office was tucked inside an old post office building that had been converted into a maze of small businesses. The kind of place where you could hear the creak of floorboards and smell 3 types of coffee, depending on which hallway you walked down. His door had a crooked plaque that read Norris and Company Legal Strategy and a little bell that jingled when I pushed it open. Caleb stood from behind a desk littered with legal pads, books, and a cracked mug that said, "World's Okayest Lawyer." "Harper, right?" he said, shaking my hand. "Come in. Mrs. Bellamy says you're stubborn and principled, my kind of client." I smiled, a little awkwardly, and sat across from him as he flipped through the folder of files I'd sent. He murmured things like time-stamped, versioned, internal asset trail. After a few minutes, he looked up. "This is good. You're not out of luck. You just need a little structure and a little pressure in the right places." I felt something inside me start to unclench. "So what happens now?" I asked. "You do nothing rash," he said. "Let me get in touch with the company's legal counsel quietly, and in the meantime, let's talk strategy." That evening, I met Rosie at the Willow Diner. The booths were covered in that shiny red vinyl that cracked when you leaned back too hard. The server, Marcia, brought our usuals without asking: grilled cheese for me, turkey club for Rosie, 2 root beers in glass bottles. I told her everything about Caleb, about the case, about what we were planning. "You're actually doing this," she whispered. "You're going to take him on." "Not exactly. I'm going to give him a choice." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Rosie leaned in. "I want to help." I blinked. "You already have." I mean really help. I know where Trent keeps the pitch decks, the ones he's tweaking for investors. If he uses your files again, if he uses that specific version, we can trace it." I hesitated. "That could put you in a tough spot." She shrugged. "Maybe. But this isn't just about work anymore. It's about decency." The next day, we met at Mrs. Bellamy's house, me, Rosie, and Caleb. Her parlor smelled faintly of lemon polish and blooming paper whites. She'd made sweet tea in mason jars and brought out an old tin box labeled Ad Agency 1977. Inside were clip-ins, campaign drafts, and a photo of a much younger June Bellamy standing next to a slogan that would later become the centerpiece of a national ad campaign, a campaign she was never credited for. I learned the hard way, she said, gently placing the tin back on the table. But at least now I can help make sure you don't. Caleb walked us through the watermark process, a subtle, invisible signature embedded in the slides. It wouldn't be obvious unless someone went looking, but it would be there. If he uses this version, Caleb said, we'll know. We finalized everything. I saved the file with the watermark. That night, under the muted glow of my desk lamp, I emailed it to Trent. He replied 2 hours later, "Great revisions. This will really impress the board." I didn't feel victorious, I felt still, like the moment right before thunder. The trap wasn't about catching him. It was about showing who I really was, what I was capable of, without ever raising my voice. If he uses it, he'll expose himself. If he doesn't, I'll know he's scared. Either way, the truth gets closer. I watched from a borrowed laptop in a borrowed parlor, sipping tea while the man who stole my voice stood one slide away from the truth. Mrs. Bellamy's living room was dimly lit by the afternoon sun, filtered through lace curtains she refused to replace. The old laptop sat on a crocheted runner that covered her oak coffee table, its fan wheezing against the weight of the live stream. I was perched on the floral couch that had hosted decades of whispered stories and quiet reckonings. Next to me, Rosie clutched her phone like a lifeline, her fingers wide around the case. Caleb stood behind us, arms folded, his face unreadable. I could feel the hush in the room, like a held breath. Trent stood at the head of a long polished table inside the company's downtown office, presenting to a semicircle of investors and senior partners. They were all dressed in muted blues and grays, the kind of colors that said, "I have nothing to prove, but I own everything." The feed buffered for a second, just as Trent cleared his throat. "Thank you all for joining today. What you're about to see," he began, "is a bold new approach, designed specifically for low-resource healthcare systems. It's called Lumina." I blinked. Lumina, that wasn't the name I'd given it, but the code, the logic, the system, it was unmistakable. The first few slides passed without incident, mostly buzzwords and market projections. Then, as he clicked to slide 4, the screen shifted to the interface I had designed. Simple, intuitive, the diagnostic flow I'd obsessed over for weeks. In the bottom corner, just faint enough to miss, unless you knew where to look, was the watermark. Harper Lang Prototype, October 9th. "Wait for it," Caleb murmured. At first, no one said anything, but then one of the older men in the room, Mr. Whitman, if I recall correctly, leaned forward. He tapped the edge of the screen. "What's that text down there?" he asked. Trent faltered. "Just a development label. Placeholder text from early testing." Whitman didn't look convinced. He leaned back, narrowed his eyes. "I've seen this before," he said slowly. "That logic pattern, it's not new. And the name Harper Lang rings a bell." My heart caught. "Excuse me," Whitman said, directing his attention to someone off camera. "Can we verify the origin of this file? Check metadata?" Trent began to fumble. I believe the final versions were compiled by our internal dev team. I supervised the process closely." At that moment, Caleb pulled out his phone and hit send. "What did you just do?" I asked. "BCC'd the board a time-stamped archive, asset logs, and the original prototype with matching metadata," he said calmly. "They'll check it. All they need now is context." The live stream cut out. Rosie looked at me. "Did we lose it?" Caleb shook his head. Number they paused the feed on their end. Privacy reasons. Probably about to call it legal. I stared at the frozen image of Trent's face, caught mid-sentence, his mouth twisted slightly, eyes wide with something between surprise and dread. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Mrs. Bellamy came in, holding a plate of cookies, completely unfazed. Someone's going to need these, she said, placing them gently on the table. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. It's over, isn't it? Caleb raised an eyebrow. Not quite, but it's starting. 2 hours later, I received a short email from HR. Trent Holloway had stepped down to pursue other opportunities. The statement was brief, neutral, but I knew what it meant. The next morning, I walked past his empty office. The blinds were shut. A box of his belongings sat untouched on the floor, his framed degree, a personalized coffee mug, a bottle of cologne still in its box. Later that day, Mr. Whitman requested a one-on-one call. I knew June Bellamy, he said the moment the camera turned on. She taught me more about strategy than 3 MBAs ever did. I smiled softly. She still teaches, in her own way. He nodded. You didn't go public. You didn't call a press conference. You played it quiet. Why? Because I didn't want revenge, I said. I wanted to be heard. I wanted my work to stand. He studied with me for a long time. It does, loud and clear. He signed off with a slight bow of his head. That night I sat in the parlor again, this time alone with Mrs. Bellamy. She poured 2 glasses of iced tea and handed one to me. You did it, she said. I shook my head. Not yet, but the noise is gone. Now I can build. She looked out the window at the darkening sky. Good, just remember, noise returns. Build something that outlasts it. Trent didn't leave the room. Security politely walked him out. They offered me the corner office. I asked for a folding table and a room with windows. After the board meeting fallout, things moved fast. My inbox turned from a graveyard to a parade. Investors, department heads, even rival companies reaching out to chat. Caleb warned me not to get swept up. Let the dust settle, he said, then build something worth the mess. So I did. When the board formally offered me the executive director role for the project Trent had tried to steal, I declined. Not because I wasn't honored, but because I didn't want to sit in a glass tower behind a nameplate someone else polished. Instead, I asked for the lease to an unused warehouse the company had bought for expansion but never developed. Something about zone-in or drainage or maybe just disinterest. I saw something else. Community. With Caleb's help, I got the paperwork through. Rosie rallied a few good folks from our old team. Mrs. Bellamy connected me with a local architecture grad who needed experience and had a soft spot for upcycled materials. Within weeks, the shell of our future came to life. It smelled like sawdust and old brick, and I loved it instantly. We named it Lang Tech Community Hub. It wasn't a corporation, it wasn't a startup. It was a living thing. A space to prototype ideas that didn't belong to boardrooms. A space where people like Rosie could teach digital skills to seniors, where kids could tinker with secondhand tech, where old ideas could find new purpose. One morning, while we were laying tile near the west entrance, Rosie's mom stopped by with sandwiches and lemonade. She wore an oversized sun hat and offered construction advice like she'd been born on a build site. You could make that a reading room, she said, pointing to a dusty nook near the back. Little couches, some good lamps. Rosie smiled. She's full of ideas. She's hired, I said, only half joking. That week, I invited them both to the Thanksgiving lunch we were hosting. No corporate sponsorship, no speeches, just folding tables, potluck dishes, and a sign out front that read, "Everyone belongs here." The Willow Diner lent us their coffee urns. A retired librarian donated hand-labeled books. The local bakery sent extra pies, apple, pumpkin, even a pecan one that tasted like memory. People came, so many I lost count. Some I recognized from the neighborhood, others from the bus line or the laundromat near my apartment. A woman brought her dog. A man brought his violin. Rosie brought joy. Caleb brought cornbread. Mrs. Bellamy stood near the window, sipping cider and watching kids chase each other between cardboard boxes labeled STEM kits do not crush. I've been to 100 strategy summits, she said softly. This one matters more. That night, after the last chair was folded, I sat alone in the front room, the string lights still glowing faintly overhead. There was a knock. Trent. He looked smaller somehow. No suit, no arrogance, just a gray hoodie and worn shoes. "Can I come in?" he asked. I hesitated, then stepped aside. He didn't sit, just looked around slowly, taking in the mismatched chairs, the corkboard of local jobs, the shelf of donated laptops. "This is what you built?" he asked. I nodded. "I didn't know," he said finally, voice quiet. "Didn't know what it meant to you." "You didn't ask." He nodded. "Fair." There was silence. "I came to apologize," he said. "Not for what you think. I know the email, the metadata, all of it. But I want to apologize for something else, for not seeing you." I looked at him then, really looked. "I'm not interested in revenge," I said. "I'm interested in change." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "My resume. Just in case. I don't know. If you ever need someone to clean floors or move boxes." I didn't take it, but I didn't push it away either. "I'm not hiring yet," I said. He nodded again and left, slowly, quietly. Later, I found the paper he'd left behind on the table. I tucked it into a drawer, not as a maybe, but as a memory. I hung the first sign, Langtech Community Hub, built on good ideas and good people. We opened our doors that evening. 3 people walked in. One was a boy with a notepad, one was a teacher, and one was Trent. Some people mark success with a plaque. I marked mine with a sticker that read, "Wi-Fi password is HOPE 2024. It was April when the Langtech Community Hub officially launched. The air still held the chill of late spring, but the light came earlier and people lingered longer in the yard out front. A group of teens chalked quotes on the sidewalk, some funny, some profound, all spelling out what this place had started to mean to them. Inside, we were chaotic in the best way. Rosie was leading a digital literacy workshop for seniors in the back room, helping a man named Dennis learn how to email his granddaughter in Tucson. Caleb had set up a consultation corner near the copier, where he offered free legal tips to entrepreneurs trying to register nonprofits. Mrs. Bellamy hosted a weekly storytelling hour that was consistently packed, part memoir, part performance art, part therapy. Trent volunteered at the reception desk. He didn't talk much, mostly just nodded and offered hand sanitizer. But he showed up every day, vacuumed without being asked, and restocked the printer paper when it ran low. I didn't assign him tasks, he just found them. I'd like to say I forgave him entirely, but it wasn't that simple. Forgiveness isn't always one grand moment. Sometimes it's a series of quiet decisions not to stay angry, to let someone rebuild without making them beg. One morning, I walked into the front room to find him helping a young girl glue recycled circuit boards into a mural shaped like a tree. She looked up and said, "He says broken stuff still has value." I stood there longer than I meant to. That afternoon, I received a letter from Mr. Whitman, handwritten on thick stock. It wasn't an offer, it was an acknowledgement. "You chose impact over accolades," he wrote. "That's rarer than it should be. If you ever want to bring your work to scale, I'll be in the room that listens." I tucked the letter into the same drawer that held Trent's resume, not for later, but for reminder. That Friday, I joined Mrs. Bellamy for tea on her porch. The wisteria had started to bloom. "You built a world," she said, passing me a cup. "We built it," I corrected. She smiled, then pointed toward the street. "There's a boy who stops by every Tuesday just to check the bulletin board. Says he likes the feeling of possibilities." That evening, I sat down at my desk in the corner office, still just a folding table, still by the window, and opened my laptop. I wrote not a pitch deck, not a grant proposal, just a story about a girl who was invisible until she refused to be, about an idea stolen but not silenced, about a place where forgotten things found new life, and about people, quiet, loud, broken, brilliant, who all belonged under one roof. When I finished the last sentence, I closed the laptop, leaned back, and listened to the hum of kids in the workshop room, to the scrape of a chair in the hall, to laughter echoing from the kitchen where Rosie was experimenting with a crockpot chili recipe, to music drifting from Trent's Bluetooth speaker, low, jazzy, uncertain. This was the kind of success you couldn't patent or publish, but you could feel it, you could live in it, and maybe, just maybe, you could leave it behind for someone else to find, because I had learned the most important thing of all. Sometimes the loudest legacy begins with someone who was once overlooked, and that someone was me. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with the quietest acts, like a stolen idea quietly reclaimed, or a folding table in a room filled with second chances. I didn't set out to build a legacy. I simply refused to let kindness and conviction be invisible. When we choose compassion over credit and listen instead of judging, something shifts, not just in others, but in ourselves. Like a porch light left on through the night, one simple act of goodwill can guide someone home. So if this story found a soft place in your heart, maybe pass that warmth along. Someone out there might be waiting to be seen just once by someone like you.